Welcome to the Colorado State Employee Assistance Program podcast, focused on personal well-being. We ask leaders across Colorado state government how they manage their own emotional well-being and mental health. My name is Natalie Newman, and I'm an EAP specialist with the Colorado State Employee Assistance Program, or CSEAP. We offer mental health counseling, leader consultation, critical incidents response, mediation, and webinar and facilitation services. You can find more information at cseap.colorado.gov. Welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to speak with another former radio person, Natriece Bryant. And Natriece is also the Public-Private Partnership Director for the state of Colorado. So it's kind of a newer thing, and, working for the state isn't a new thing, even though this position is.
Yes, that's accurate. So I've been with the state since 2013. I started working at the Department of Revenue, where I was doing a couple different things in relation to policy governance and things of that nature. And so worked in the Department of Revenue at the DMV, and then also worked in the Medical Marijuana and Marijuana Enforcement Division until about 2015. Then I moved over to the Department of Regulatory Agencies, where I oversaw the Banking and Financial Services Unit in regard to educating people about their finances. So working with disadvantaged communities, and then also working with banks and credit unions to ensure that we were able to help them understand the regulatory nature behind fraud. So helping them identify fraud at the front desk, identify if someone were to come into an office and be misrepresented in regard to how they were trying to withdraw funds. And so that was a really cool job. And then I went over to the Department of Local Affairs, where I was the Deputy Executive Director overseeing housing, the census, local government, property taxation, and all those other things that are in that particular department. Fast forward, now I'm over here working in P3 projects, which is public-private partnerships, focusing primarily on 4 different things: affordable housing, early child care services, behavioral and mental health capacity expansion, and then also broadband services.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think a lot of the things that you talked about that you've done, I think we don't often acknowledge enough of how housing, how much you get paid, your income, understanding your finances, how that also impacts mental health.
That's accurate. And I think a lot of times when we're looking at finances, we assume that because everybody appears okay on the outside, that they're also okay inside. But the reality is you have to put in different mechanisms to be able to take care of yourself.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And now, certainly, it's January, it's a new year, a new legislative session. Oftentimes, people like to reflect and set goals for this time of year. And so I'm curious, how do you prepare for and plan for mental health and wellness goals for the new year, both personally and professionally?
I've learned over the past probably 5 or 6 years to put yourself first. And so what that looks like for me is I prep myself and I try to create time. I think we take time for granted. Time is one of the most important things when it comes to being able to put yourself in a good space. And so as we're getting ready to ramp up legislative session, I know I'm going to have to testify in different places. I know I'm going to have to, talk through what our office is going to be doing both legislatively, but then also in the community. And so one of the things that I've always tried to do is at least give myself a good amount of time to be able to prepare myself. So starting about November, December, I start to look at, what are we looking at for the upcoming year? I do take the last week of the year off to spend time with my girls. I have 2 kids. They're 16 and 12, so that's an interesting other piece when it comes to trying to plan. And so making sure that I put more personal time towards the end of the year so I can kind of clear out the end of the year, come back fully refreshed and ready to start session. But also, some self-care is something that I definitely try to do also with my girls. So on the last week of the year, we have like a spa day, we do meditation, we go to yoga, and those are things that I feel like are really important because as you're constantly in this hustle and bustle of work, especially when you're working hybrid or remote, there is not that separation between work and home. And so I remember pre-COVID, we used to, I live far, so I had like an hour drive or an hour commute that I could just decompress and kind of separate myself from work, separate myself from what we had just finished, and then go home and be a parent as well. Now we don't necessarily have that. It's basically me going out of my office in my house into the kitchen. So there's not that's a 2-minute separation, right? Versus the hour that I used to have. So I do try to listen to music. I try to meditate. And I think a lot of times turning off my brain is probably one of the hardest things that I had to try to figure out, like, how do we do that?
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, being a mom and having 2 daughters and also having this role at the state. How do you maintain your resilience to juggle the various hats that I imagine you wear?
I work out, and so I found some strength and fitness. I've always, like, before I was an adult, I was a dancer. So I was a tap dancer, jazz, and pointe. So when you're standing on your little tippy toes and hurt your ankles, I did all of that. And so I clearly can't do that anymore. So I found some strength and fitness. And so I dedicate an hour to an hour and a half every day to have that separation. So I'm at home most of the time, working from home. So at around 5:30-ish, I'll shut the computer down, go downstairs, and we created this little gym in our house. So I'll work out, and then I have that separation that I've created, and then I go upstairs and, like, do the mom thing. Raising 2 daughters is something that I'm really, really excited about, but also, like, teenagers are tough. So they have their own things that they're experiencing. You're trying to coach them in, like, how to deal with, at the time, I was trying to coach them on how to deal with a virtual school environment, which I don't know how to manage. And then they went back to school, and it was kind of talking to them about good choices, good decisions, and, like, it's not a free-for-all. So you're trying to balance good behavior with your kids, but then also trying to balance good behavior with yourself. And if they see that, especially from a mom, exercising and trying to take care of your health, then they also reciprocate those things. So my oldest daughter is a track and cheer person, so she runs, which she did not get that from me. So she's constantly busy, constantly doing something. My youngest is a dancer, so she kind of followed in my footsteps, where she does tap and hip hop and jazz and all of those things. And so they have this sort of, like, mental preparedness in regard to getting themselves healthy. And health is more than just your physical being. It's also, like, prepping yourself mentally. And I think a lot of times we think of, like, oh, well, you're just going to go work out and run on the treadmill. But the reality is that your endorphins and all the things that you exude while you're working out actually do clear your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like you're really trying to instill and model that for your daughters as well.
I am. Teenagerness and preteens is hard. I mean, you've got all these different things that are happening in school and in personal life, and I think you add social media to the conversation. It's things that you and I probably never had to deal with when we were in school. We didn't have the consistent connectivity. Like, if we had a problem at school, we went home, and then we go back to school, and hopefully everybody forgot about it. Now, there's not that, again, separation. And I think one of the things that I try to instill in my girls is that as you're going through this thing called life, there's definitely a need for you to be mentally strong, but sometimes that means different things for different people. And so being comfortable enough to know that your mom is free enough to have a conversation with you about what's going on in your life, and that because I'm busy, I'm never too busy for them.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious what the single most useful thing that you do personally for your mental health.
I travel. I think that traveling is something that frees me up. My husband, we have the benefit of, he works for Southwest Airlines, which this week is probably not the best thing, but he works for Southwest, and so we travel probably 3 to 4 times a year. And what it does is it exposes us to different cultures and different communities and different people, and that changes your mental capacity to understand human beings and understand, like, who they are, but it also allows for us to experience different things. And also, like, the beach is my favorite place to go, for example, and just the pure sense of silence when you go by the water is, like, the most relaxing thing. So, like, we clearly don't live by a beach in Colorado, but when you go there, it's like that sense of silence is just such an important piece, and I think a lot of times we forget to just be.
Yeah, it's certainly something that we don't often do in a busy world. We're always kind of running and produce.
Exactly. And that production is great, right? But if you don't take time, it's like a battery. You consistently run it until you're empty. And once you're empty, you have nothing else left to give. So that's why I feel like it's important to take frequent breaks. I remember when I first started at just working, like, as a professional, not even at the state, I didn't take my vacation time because it was like, oh, well, if I take time off, I'm going to come back, there's going to be twice as much work. But if you continuously run yourself on empty, it doesn't matter how much work there is because you're not going to get anything done because you're going to literally just be drained. Like I said, I take the last week of the year off, and I've really started to try to take better care, and like PTO is there for a reason and I should use it. And I was one of the employees that was like, use it or lose it. And I was always the one that was like, can I roll it over? Can I roll this over for next year? And then what I started to recognize is, rolling it over to next year doesn't change anything. I'm still stressed out. I'm still burnt out. I'm still tired. And I rolled it over. So now I have more time that I have to try to plan in a shorter period of time. It's not a sustainable way of operating. So take your time off, please.
Yeah, it reminds me of this phrase that keeps coming up of like, what's good for you is good for the relationship, like the work relationship, or what's good for you is good for the collective, really.
Right. Yeah, that's another thing that I think is really important is like you are exuding energy. And if your energy is bad because you're stressed out, you're not taking time, you're constantly working, you're constantly producing, there's no way that for the collective group you're going to be in a good space. And so I think, part of work is that we continuously think about, like you said, production. How do I get the most out of myself? And you can't do that when your energy level is completely gone. So I think that when you're looking at the collective, creating a good group environment is also something that's really productive. Laughing with your team, checking in with your team. I think those things are really important that might have fallen off the wayside while we were on screens the whole time. Like, when do you do your check-ins? It's not as easy for us to walk into someone's office anymore and just say, hey, how are you doing? So I think those are also important.
Yeah. Now, what are some simple strategies, for managing stress in the workplace?
That's a good question. So at one point in time, I think at one of my jobs, I had 14 direct reports, which was kind of a challenge, right? And then I moved to another department and I had 22 direct reports. How do you check in with people, with individuals of that nature? And what I did is I made sure that I had biweekly check-ins with them. Even if it wasn't to talk about work, it was simply just to be like, hey, how are you doing? How are you progressing in your job? What's going on in your personal life? Those things matter. And I think if you have an environment that you create a safe space, people will react differently in your work environment. I think also, as we look at the dynamics of teams, you also have to accept people where they are. And I think a lot of times, as we start to transition again to this new workforce of what that looks like for us, we're very, again, personal people. So we go in, we check in, we talk, we knock on doors, we have a conversation. You can still do that in a virtual environment. It just looks a little bit different. And so every time we start a meeting within anyone on my team or with anybody that's part of our team, we check in with each other the first 5 minutes. We don't just jump right into the conversation. And I know, we've tried to implement, do we do half-hour meetings? Do we do 45-minute meetings? Or do we do that full hour? And sometimes that full hour allows for us to have that 15-minute check-in of how's everybody doing. I do tend to, if someone joins a call and they, have their hands over their face or they just look really stressed out, hey, how are you doing? Is there something we need to chat about? And most of the time people will open up and be like, oh, yeah, well, this last meeting I just got off of was really stressful, but I'm fine now. And so, just having those mental check-ins with people shows that you recognize that they're having a difficult time, but I think also acknowledging that we're all human and that we don't come in bubbly and bright every time we jump onto a call. And so giving people space to have that freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. And have all of those feelings and emotions and time to kind of integrate from that last meeting that you may have just finished 30 seconds before joining this next one.
Right. We don't have that separation anymore. I mean, I remember pre-pandemic where you had 15 minutes to go to the bathroom or get up and walk around, go grab a snack. Now, at least with my calendar, everything's back to back. So there might literally be times where I'm in meetings every single moment of the day. And so sometimes I just need to stand up, or sometimes I just need hey, can I have 5 extra minutes because I need to just go walk around for 5 minutes because my legs are asleep. I think that we need to continue to recognize that those transition periods, again, we're talking about transition, going from talking about a meeting about budget to talking to another meeting about, an HR issue to talking about hiring to going at if you don't have a moment to pause, you continuously are just constantly in go, go, go phase, and you haven't actually had time to react to anything that you've actually talked about for the last 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah. Absolutely. It sounds like that's really important for you to model for your team as a leader, is kind of taking that space and, hey, I need to walk, or hey, how are you doing?
Yeah, it is. We even used to have fun stuff. So we'd have like an ugly sweater party virtually. We do like every other Friday, we would just do like a Friday check-in with everybody. No intention of just, business operations, but more of just, hey, how was everybody's week? And I think employees appreciate that because we used to do that. We used to do that where you'd walk and have water cooler conversations. You're in the kitchen heating up your food. We used to do those things. And I think we've gotten so focused in the business aspect that we don't have time to breathe. And so it was important to me, and it still is, that we're able to do those mental resets with people and not have them feel like they consistently have to be in the operations mode.
Yeah. We're multifaceted people. We're not just the job that we do here.
Right. And every time I ask people that, that's funny that you mentioned that. I always ask people, like, as icebreakers, if you want to call it that, like, how do you identify? And it's funny because a lot of people will say what they do for a living as their immediate point of identity. And I always say, I'm a mom. That's always like the first thing that I say. I'm a mom and a wife, and then I also do X, my job. And I think that models for people that we have to recognize that you are not your job, that your job is part of your life, but there's also another component that you have to identify with.
Yeah. You're also a Black woman.
Yeah.
And so how does that identity also play a role into how you take care of yourself?
That's a good question, because in the Black community, we don't typically talk about mental health. We kind of keep everything, like, we don't share outside of our families what's going on at home. I remember when I was younger, it was always like, well, we don't get counseling. We don't do therapy because, like, you just deal with it. You just toughen it up. And it's funny because in my role, I'm usually the only Black woman at the table most of the time. In the last, like, probably 6 or 7 years, in my director, like, I've always been like a director hire in the last couple of years. And I've always been the only Black woman at the table. And so, like, that drains you. You walk in and you're kind of looking. And I remember it brings back memories when I was in school where I would always be looking for someone who looked like me. And when you don't find that person, when you immediately walk into the room, that sense of comfort or like someone you can connect with, it's like, oh, here we go. And I almost feel like you have to try 3 times harder. Like, I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, and I'm young. At least, like, people think I'm young. So it feels as though I'm consistently trying to prove why I belong at the table. Not because I don't, but because I think society-wise, when you're a younger person, it's like, oh, well, she's moving up the ladder. Or, like, how have you gotten here? Like, what did you do? And, like, I constantly get questions of that nature. And I think, some of the things that I've been asked, like, they're offensive. And I think people think they're complimentary. Like, oh, well, you speak so well. Well, how would you think I would speak? Like, what does that mean? And, calling them out on it when they say those things. Oh, well, I meant it as a compliment. I'm like, but how else would someone speak? You know what I mean? So I think that those are challenges that I will continue to face and constantly come across. And being in a field, I'm dealing with major real estate transactions. And, there's women in that field. Are there a lot of Black women? Not really. And so when I'm having conversations with developers, I'm going in and talking with, like, high-level, high-ranking financial people that can do math really well. It kind of is like, do I belong here? And the answer is yes, right? The answer is yes, I do. And I worked hard to get here. But there is that sometimes sense of, like, it's exhausting to never see someone who looks like you in the room.
Yeah. Of having to constantly kind of figure out how to relate.
Yeah, and how to navigate, right? Like, how do you navigate a conversation where you're the only woman in the room? It's not just being the only Black woman. It's also being the only woman where you're in meetings and conversations with men, which is fine. But having to feel like, you have to come across twice as strong or try twice as hard to get your point across, or, not having someone overtalk you because your voice is it doesn't carry as much or isn't as loud. So those are things that I deal with, and I've gotten used to them, and I don't know that I should have, but you kind of get used to it, and you just come and you represent and you sit at the table and you belong there. But at the same time, you're still looking for that connection point. So I get excited when I see other people of color in the room. I get excited when I see other women in the room. But there are definitely times where I go into conversations where I am the only one. And I just kind of plow through it. And I don't know that that's the healthiest way to do it, but it kind of is where we are in society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking, right, there's that modeling that you're doing to show, like, hey, this is a space where I belong. And I know for me, I'm a half Filipino, half white passing, and, experience some of that myself of like, ooh, do I belong here? Or am I being asked that because I'm young looking or female or whatnot? And that self-doubt can also take a toll.
It does take a toll, but also I think it also gives you power, right? And so I think when people question you, it's kind of like they acknowledge and recognize that you are younger looking or you're a person of color, and they're acknowledging it, not maybe necessarily in the best sense, but they acknowledge that you're different. And I think we have to take power with those differences and like own those things. I think, as we navigate through our careers, there's going to be continuous times where you come across people who don't think you belong at the table. And it's not our job to prove to them that we do, but it's our job to know that we do. And that sense of confidence, I think, exudes itself. And if you are not mentally strong enough to be able to exude that sense of confidence, people will see through it. And that's where you find problems, and you find that people will bully you or say, ask you questions that they hope you can't answer. And when you can, it's like, yeah, I know that because I belong at the table. And so that's a sense of pride that I think we have to take into consideration.
Absolutely. Well, and with that, how do you care for yourself after those types of encounterments, engagements, meetings?
That's a good question. There are times when I was first going through my first oh my gosh, I'm the only person here. I would go sit in my car and be like, oh my God, I cannot believe that I just had to go through that. But then reassuring myself, and my husband's great. I'd call him sometimes, I can't believe I just went through this and it was so stressful. And he's like, but you're built for this. This is what you were brought into this position, whatever it is, to do. But self-care, I've learned, I can't tell you that I've always been like this, because I used to have a huge sense of self-doubt because people would remind me of my age. They would remind me how I look. And so I've gotten to a point where I'm able to just breathe after those meetings. And there's times where I will literally sit in my car for another 5 to 10 minutes if I'm leaving a physical meeting and just sit there and reflect. And I think those reflections are really important because it kind of shows you, wow, I did this and I'm in a good space and I'm fine about it, or I'm not fine and that really was bad and it was a really bad experience, but I'm going to be okay. Those mental exercises are things that I think are really important, and it's kind of like juggling your brain around, being there's a sense where you know that you did what you were supposed to do and you know that you were successful, but there's also this why do I have to do that? Why is this continuously a conversation I have to have? And I think in the environment that we're in now, I think people have to do it more than they used to. And those things, like I said, peace and quiet is one of the things that I really value. I've learned to just turn my brain off and say, that is over for me. I did it successfully and we're done, and not think about it ever again. But also use it to prepare myself for when it happens, not if, but when it happens again. The other thing that I do for mentally preparing myself for difficult situations is I literally take about 10 minutes before I enter anything that I know is going to be stressful and just walk through what I'm going to say. I might get curveballs thrown at me while I'm in there, but if I practice and know where I'm at, read the notes that I wanted to go through, I'll be mentally prepared. But that silence is really necessary for me, because there's constantly something going on in Natrice's head. I'm thinking about now, what are we eating for lunch? So you have to have that time to just disconnect yourself.
Right. Kind of like the Shavasana in yoga.
Yes.
You need that rest to integrate.
Yes, you absolutely do. And I think if we could just take yoga and practice it in our real lives, I think that would be good. But I think also you have individuals that are not able to shut off everything going on because that's how they operate. But I do think that, I was talking to a friend the other day and she was telling me if she gets stressed out, I learned that I have anxiety. It doesn't come across. You would never guess it by looking at me, but I do. I fidget a lot, and I love that we're
that duck, yeah, right? Calm on the surface, and those feet are really
I'm literally underneath the water, oh my goodness. But I got this Janseo ring. It's a Japanese ring where I can actually use it and like move it. And then so it actually exudes and helps you with anxiety because it's like a fidget ring. But you would never know that, right? So like when I'm going into a stressful situation, I actually put it on, and then like every now and then no one can see it, but like under the table I'll like just move it. And it actually just that sense of movement, because you're not stressed, you're not constantly like, ugh. And I speak in front of people all the time. I was the commencement speaker for the fall graduation at CU where there was like 7,500 people. And everyone's like, you look so calm. I was like, I was terrified. And I literally just had to stop for a moment and just breathe, because public speaking did not used to be easy for me. So I love to constantly learn things. So I'll look up stuff like what helps with, anxiety, and like how do you calm down. And I didn't realize I had anxiety until like probably 2 years ago, because I just pushed through it. It was like, oh, well, here we go. But like inside you have these heart palpitations. Like you can feel your body literally like, we're about to go through something that's really going to stress us out. And you're like, but here we are, girl. We got to do it. And so when I finally took a moment and took a step back and was like, Natriece, you might have a little bit of anxiety. I'm like, self, yes, we might. And so when I started to do research about like what calms the brain, it's usually that slowing down of what it is that stresses you out. And then I was like, this ring is actually a thing. I actually don't have to wear it anymore because I actually have learned how to mentally just calm myself down. It's like if you just stand and be still, and like it's that stillness that actually brings calmness to you. And so you learn those things, whether it's through reading, whether it's through research, or just like finding what works for you. We have to check in with ourselves. And I think a lot of times we forget to do that.
Yeah.
And I know people take breath as like for granted, but if you really practice breathing successfully and you're not short of breath and you just literally are able to like deep breath in, deep breath out, you'll be amazed how much it can calm you down. And I think, we don't talk about that type of stuff. It's like, oh, well, you just, you're stressed out. It's going to be fine. People will tell you it's going to be fine. But what does fine look like to people? What does fine look like for you? If you're not able to address that, it's not fine. And you go in and you're like, palms are sweaty and you don't know what you're going to do and your mind is racing and you're drinking a ton of water and you think that's going to calm you down, but really it's all mental. And you do have to slow down in order for you to be able to work through and pound through those issues.
Yeah. No, this is great. Thank you so much for this conversation, Natriece. One of my favorite questions to ask is, what does self-care look like at its worst for you?
It looks stressful. Like, we actually just got out of that whole period where my oldest had a cheer competition in Douglas County. My youngest had a competition in like Southwest Denver. And I was like, so who's going to get them at both places? And I literally, and my husband had to work that day, so there was like no way. And my daughter also, by the way, does not want to drive. So I'm like, she's 16, she can do it, and like she knows how to drive. She just doesn't want to drive, which I get, right? Because it causes her like stress, and highways are very stressful for everybody. But I had to like literally like self-care in that situation where I was like, everybody has to be there at 9, and I have no idea how this is gonna work. When I really took a step back and like just breathe, I looked at the fact that my oldest had to be there at 9, but she really didn't actually compete until 1. My youngest had to be there at 9. She competed at 10. She'd be done by 12, and then we could shoot back over to the oldest competition and still be there to support her, because that's really important for me to be physically present for my kids. And when you take a step back, self-care at its worst situation really is just taking a step back and looking at how bad is the situation actually. Now, if they both actually competed at 9, we would have had a separate situation. But I was stressing myself out because on the surface, 9 o'clock was my thing. But the reality was, if you look deeper into it, take a step back, stop focusing on just the surface issue, I was able to do both, right? It was still stressful. Like I still had to drive and I still had to go across town. But I was actually able to do it, and I asked for help with the other moms. But if you look at those types of situations where you have to be 2 people in one and have to be there for both of your kids, when the reality comes into play, the anxiety kicked in immediately. I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And then I was like, just breathe. And then you started to look at the actual circumstance. You realize that it actually is going to be okay.
Thank you so much for that example and for this conversation. I've really appreciated it. And yeah, anything else, anything we missed or anything?
Yeah, just make sure that you take time for yourself. I think I mentioned time multiple times, but I think we get so wrapped up in our 8 to 5, 9 to 6, whatever hours you work, 7 to 4:30, whatever, that we forget that it is okay to not be okay. And so I think that people should embrace that. And, whatever your journey looks like, you have to embrace those things. And so taking a step back, looking at, am I taking care of myself? Am I taking enough time? Please take your time off. Please take the vacations that you need to take, and take those mental health days if you need to as well. I think the healthier you are internally, the better you are on the outside.